specific donor.
Yeah. And this is why we didn't feel it was morally right to ask for money from other, like to have a Patreon and to do all these other extra things. We also had another donor approach us when we were in California and offered us support financially, and we put that on the back burner because we didn't feel it was morally right, because
they had so much
sufficient amount of money.
You had so much money. They had so much money from that donor. They didn't even want to take more money from other donors.
I wanted to say there,
$1.5 million US a year. 1.5 million. That's what they were getting. This Paul and Asal right here, the ones that were running or are running Anonymous for the Voiceless, with 30 employees. And I don't even think all of those are full-time. Oh my God. So, okay, I had to talk about this really quickly. I don't have time to edit or, wait till I have time to edit. So I'm just going to talk about it really briefly right now. This podcast that Paul and Asal put out. Again, they're Anonymous for the Voiceless. And they are a not-for-profit organization, Grassroots. When you look it up on Wikipedia or anywhere, their Facebook page, that's what it says. Grassroots, right? And all we hear from vegans is how the meat and dairy industry is funding everything. Funding everything. But Tristan over here, he ain't getting no support. You don't know any anti-vegan, any, what do you want to call us? We're standing up for the humans' freedoms. And as Tristan says, this is one of the most important aspects to what we are doing. We are standing up for the freedom to be able to choose to live off of our own land, if we so choose, if that's what we want to do. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But to not be able to have that choice. Vegans don't want that choice. They don't care about having that choice because they never plan on doing that. They never plan on doing that because they know they can't. They never can. They have to live in a huge monocrop system where they can pick and choose all these different foods to eat. Not to mention all their biotech companies, all their Beyond Meats, their fake milks and cheeses. And basically what vegans are asking you to do is move from one industry, this huge meat and dairy industry, which they're a $1 billion industry, whatever. There's lots of $1 billion industries. But they're asking you to move from there to another big industry, which is going to be even bigger because there will be only a handful of people that control all of this food system. And they are backed by big money, as you can see. And there may be, a lot of grassroots vegans. But they are pawns. They don't see it. They don't comprehend what they are doing. They are handing their rights over. They are willingly giving their human freedoms over because they think they are standing up for the animals. So as we can see, these bigger organizations for veganism, even people like Joey Carbstrong that look like they're standing alone, these are not specifically grassroots. They are being backed by donors, by big-time donors. This is why Joey Carbstrong got caught up in all this mess. Because he knows the donor. Just like No Tell and Earthling Ed, so many others probably do. And it may not be the same one. This donor doesn't want to be named, doesn't want to be known. I wonder why. You're doing something so amazing for the animals, for humanity. Why don't you want everyone to know your name? I'll tell you why. Because if people start researching these donors, they probably have ties into this globalist sort of eugenics background. You could probably find a lot of dirt. You could probably find a lot of sketchy shit. But I'm getting too off topic. Let me explain. So Paul and Asal, they had a falling out with their donor. So Okay, what you're seeing here, it's very fine print. This is Joey's response. And at the end, after I speak, I'm going to let the grumpy vegan grandpa, whatever his name is, I'm going to let him read it because it's pretty long. It's like 7 minutes long. So I'm going to put that at the end. But let me tell you, you might want to hear that because it is a more accurate description than Paul and Asal gave of what's going on. I believe Joey's actually completely correct about what he's saying. Paul and Asal were saying when their donor came to them with issues, you know, with they didn't mention transparency as one of those issues. They acted like it started with, you know, the Black Lives Matter stuff. They didn't like how they didn't speak out about that. You know, people were coming to them, to the donor, with concerns because of that. That's how it all started. And there were like a couple of other discrepancies. They were acting really vague and shameful and bizarre and just low energy. The way they were describing this, they were talking really slowly. And yeah, it was just like something, you could tell something more. You know, there was a lot they weren't saying. But ultimately, the donor told them that they wanted, because it's just those two, Paul and Asal, who sit on the board, quote unquote, which there isn't a board right now, for Anonymous for the Voiceless. And the donor wanted a board of 20. You know, I mean, is that too crazy to ask? You want it to be run like a real organization with real, you know, checks and balances when you're given this much money? That doesn't seem, you know, too offensive to me. But Paul and Asal got very offended by that. They said, oh, that came across as, you don't trust us. We want to put other people in charge. But Paul and Asal would be sitting on this board of 20. So what's their problem? I think they got used to this, living this lifestyle and being able to do whatever the hell they wanted to with all this money. And they didn't like this. They were like, if you don't want to do it, we had somebody else approach us. There are plenty of billionaire globalists that will fund us. I can promise you that. This huge donor happens to know Joey, and this is where they start throwing Joey under the bus. They, you know, he asked Joey to come and mediate the situation because Joey's not dumb. You know, Joey comes from the street. He will comply. If he's getting this much money, oh yes, sir. Oh yes, sir. I'll get a board together if that's what you want. So he gets on the phone with Paul and Asal, and that's when they started like throwing him under the bus, saying, oh, he looks all pale and anxious. I don't know the specific words they used, but Tristan was like, isn't that Joey? Isn't that how he always looks and acts? But anyway, he probably was. He probably was because he's sort of like, okay, what's the problem here? You know, why can't y'all just play ball like everybody else does? What's the problem? So I guess because Joey didn't just completely side with them on this, they are all mad, throwing him under the bus. But anyway, there are even Facebook pages popping up. Vegans are making these pages about Anonymous for the Voiceless and how we need transparency. So they're ultimately being canceled right now over this crap. It's supposed to be about the animals. And AV is blaming everyone else and their mama. So here's what Joey had to say about all of this. I'm going to let grumpy old granddad read it, and I'll put all the links in the description.
The following statement is a response to the recent situation with Anonymous for the Voiceless, AV. Firstly, I want to address the claim made by Paul and Hazel from the AV that I set out to cancel AV. This accusation is damaging and untrue. I've collaborated with and promoted AV across my channels from day one, which he has. I've had an AV link in my YouTube channel for years, and I had a segment on AV outreach in nearly all my speeches, encouraging activists to join. What happened was a major donor had concerns with AV, and the relationship between this donor and Paul and Hazel was breaking down. This came to a head after AV published a controversial Black Lives Matter protest post, which upset many people and resulted in a number of complaints to AV's donor. This was compounded by other concerns, including AV groups not receiving funding from Paul and Hazel. After much consideration, the donor reached out to me to help to try and resolve the matter. As a friend of the donor, I was asked to be involved because I had no ill feelings towards AV and in fact had been a long-time friend and supporter of the work. Furthermore, I have experience and understanding with grassroots activism on the ground. The goal was to help AV continue to receive their funding and work with them in fulfilling the donor's request for financial transparency. Although I was a little taken aback by this request to get involved, I assumed that as a non-profit organisation they would be open, honest and compliant to regain the trust of their donor. Of course. The impression given by AV was that their funding started this year. Although they did receive a large amount of funding in 2019 as well. The budget agreed by the donor was for $1.5 million US. That was to be paid in blocks of $100,000 US roughly every 3 weeks. AV had already received around half of their funding for the year, around $700,000 US, almost $1 million Australian dollars. The main financial concerns included the breakdown in salary costs, $946,000, the AV fund, $360,000, which is a number of AV groups said they hadn't received. The high cost of developing an app, $150,000 Australian dollars, and a large touring campaign budget of $300K in a year when travel was restricted because of COVID. They also never readjusted this travel budget to suit the current situation of all travel being restricted. Operationally, there were more concerns with ASO being the only treasurer and the handling of all the funds and payroll. For the founder to have sole responsibility for these functions in an organisation of this size and income, it did raise concern and is not best practice for demonstrating strong financial controls. In most charities, there is an independent board of trustees who oversee the organisation's operations and financial stability. This is not the case with AV, where there is a lack of financial accountability, and all funds are received and distributed by Paul and Hazel as they see fit, with no oversight by anyone else in the organisation. After back and forth deliberation with AV and the donor, Paul and Hazel refused to give the type of transparency the donor is requesting. We had support of a professional accountant, so I wouldn't have been operating on my own, as has been suggested. The fact that Paul and Hazel claimed they wouldn't give the donor access to their charity accounts because they had their personal accounts linked in with them, which is strange, and after consulting with a professional is extremely out of the ordinary. I mean, why would you have your personal accounts linked in with a charity account? In our first call, Paul said to me they had been putting away money for a rainy day, and that's why the budget numbers might have been higher than their actual spend. After I said to Paul this might not look good if you have reserve money that you haven't declared to the donor, Paul later retracted this statement, claiming they had no reserve of money, which did leave me confused and suspicious. The claim made by Paul and Hazel that if we were given access to the charity account we would take the money back really surprised me, seeing as Paul claimed they had actually no reserve funds. And it's also ridiculous to believe that I would steal from them when I have access to the same donor they do. They also claimed to me in one of our calls that although they might have needed the donor at the beginning, they don't necessarily need them anymore and they could go on without them. This didn't make sense as they had so many staff. They say they have 30 and no reserve of funds, yet they would rather let go of their main source of funding instead of giving the donor transparency they were looking for. This did ring alarm bells with me, as it seemed they would rather lose $1.5 million US a year than comply with the donor's request, essentially defunding the whole of AV. This money the donor gives is for the animals, and if they are not 100% confident on where the funding is going, then they have every right to stop funding, as does anyone. The donor has never defunded an organisation like this before, so these circumstances were unique. AV were reluctant to take suggestions from the donor, showed arrogance and spoke with contempt towards almost all involved. Also, for them to compare my Patreon, my YouTube and the rather modest amounts I receive from the donor to help with a few staff, 2 full-time staff and some occasional freelancers, and travel when needed, to organisation with a 2.2 million Australian dollar a year income is nowhere near comparable and extremely misleading on their part. As a public charity with one major donor, it should not come as a surprise to be expected to provide this kind of transparency. If you refuse and your funding is cut by the donor, I'm sorry, but that is not my fault. Paul and Hazel have made some incredibly damaging claims about my intentions when I was just trying to help them, when no one else would. I tried my best to help AV come to an amicable solution with the donor so AV could continue receiving their funding. But the donor was very firm on their request for this type of financial transparency. As the numbers were so high, but the donor was very firm on their request for this type of financial transparency as the numbers were so high. AV claimed on many occasions on our calls that they already knew their funding may be cut for other reasons than that they were prepared for that, so to blame me for defunding AV is dishonest and disappointing. No matter what my relationship is with the founders of AV, I will always support grassroots activists on the ground. Thank you for taking the time to consider my side of these events. This will be my final statement on the matter,